Granito Award recipient was Daniel Madrzykowski, and Dan's at the at NIST, and his presentation was just fabulous. And I always like to listen to it because, as Chris suggested this morning, I'm a behavioralist. I like quantitative data, and this organization does that. There's a lot of research, real science going on at NIST, and I like to listen to what he has to say. Today he's going to talk about firefighting research and the federally funded renaissance. And so he says the glass is not half empty. It's looking pretty good, I think, is what you're going to argue about federal government funding for fire-related research, scientific-based research. So I present to you then Dan Madrzykowski.
Bob, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I enjoyed coming here and working with folks that are sort of on the soft science side, the management and leadership, because it gives me a chance to sit down and think about some of our issues and our problems in a little different light. So this presentation is not on fire dynamics, although I will manage to sneak a little bit of that in there because I just can't help myself. But it's really an exciting time to be a fire researcher, and I'm hoping that the fire service appreciates what an exciting time it is, an exciting time for change for them. And not only change for them, but support for them. So they have a better understanding of the environment they're working in. They have a better understanding of the protection or the lack of protection certain components of their gear provide. And the whole goal is to help them do their job in a safer manner and to be more effective and to help the people that they serve, right? And it's pretty positive that I was lucky enough, and others that I work with are lucky enough that this confluence of things kind of came together. And maybe someone planned it, or maybe it just happened. We'll see. So I'm going to give you a brief history of where we've been, and I'll try to keep that pretty brief. And then we're going to really talk to the center point today of the Assistance to Firefighters grants, because that's sort of been the big change in this social science experiment that we call the federal government. And it's had really positive outcomes as the synergistic efforts between the fire service and the research community and the federal government really came together to provide some very, very positive outcomes, and I'll give you some examples of those. So we're going to start in 1968. In 1968, there was the Fire Research and Safety Act. And from the NIST perspective, or the National Bureau of Standards perspective, which then became NIST, you could see that NIST got quite a bit of authority. All of a sudden, they got authority to investigate fires. They got authority that said they could improve methods of fire prevention and control. They could work on fire information and reference services, i.e. a library. Educational and training programs on how to improve the efficiency, the operation, and the organization of fire services. That was all put in their purview. They had about 30 people on staff at the time that were in various parts of NBS, and they brought them together, and the hiring surge began. They got about $5 million to start with. One of the goals was a long-term plan. And also in this act, and not to be lost because this becomes very important, this act also authorized the National Commission on Fire Prevention and Control, which I'm sure everyone will recognize that 5 years after this point will release the document America Burning. And of course that has a very, very big impact. But this was sort of the starting point. What happened as a result of that? Well, NIST did research on ground ladders. They got with a metallurgist, Harvey Utek, that was working at NIST, and he started looking at these aluminum ladder failures and trying to understand why. They start looking at rung spacing. They start looking at a wide variety of things, wooden ladder burn through, things like that, and they resulted in changes to, at the time, what was NFPA 193. Helmets and turnout gear. At the time that they started, there wasn't an NFPA standard for helmets and turnout gear or boots and gloves. And so they started doing research on that. What kind of helmets did they have back then? Typically aluminum helmets and leather helmets. So they started to look at that. Well, You know, again, if you got a live wire, aluminum helmet's not a very handy thing. Aluminum's also known for conducting heat pretty well. So again, there were some trade-offs here as people were looking back and forth about what it is you wanted your turnout gear to do for you. And this concept of bunker gear was starting to come up. Now, most parts of the country in the 60s, even in the 1960s, there were guys saying in Illinois that when they joined the fire department, they would basically wear their work coat, their farm heavy work coat from the winter, and they'd be given some gloves. If they were a specialized unit, they might get some of the fireball gloves, which were the cotton gloves that were dipped in vinyl, and they're bright orange. Otherwise, they'd just wear their work gloves. And of course, you have to get a helmet. Helmet sort of completed the package. Other than that, wear some sturdy footwear. You really didn't have much in the way of turnout gear. Now, other departments, the more advanced departments, they had three-quarter boots, they had longer coats, and professional gloves, if you will. Very nice helmets, salty dog helmets. You got to have that with the leather front piece and all that. But there's no standards for it. And they started to do testing. And, you know, do you want to have a coat that has a plastic, if you want to make your coat waterproof, do you want to have it soaked in plastic? Probably not, right? Do you want to have a coat that's covered in linseed oil to make it more waterproof? Probably not. All these sort of things start coming into play. What textiles are they really using in these coats? Do you want to have a rubber coat? Probably not. So that was the basis. They had all these baseline tests that they created at NBS that became the basis for NFPA 1971. One of the first fire libraries in the country was started. And, you know, I used it for many, many years. And then, of course, out of that, America Burning was issued in 1973. So the story continues. Because of America Burning, because of the work that was accomplished, basically the fire service, the folks that had that political ear at the time, the political will at the time that said we need something done for the firefighters in the United States, got the next law passed, the Federal Fire Prevention and Safety Act. It should be Control Act, I think. And as a result, they got the National Fire Prevention and Control Administration, which will become USFA, started, and that was also located in the U.S. Department of Commerce at the time. And it had pretty good funding the first year, $10 million. The second year, the funding increased by 50% to $15 million. It made the administrator of the group a presidential appointee to show just what level of interest there needed to be here with regard to this fire problem in the United States. They started an academy that then later will become the National Fire Academy. The National Fire Data Center, I believe, still holds the same title. And they were charged with technology development, testing, evaluation of fire and rescue equipment, standardization, compatibility, and interchangeability of equipment, research concerning the effectiveness or the productivity of firefighters, and, of course, assisting in the development of new technologies and new standards. Well, as you might see, there was a lot of overlap between what NBS had been given responsibility for and now what this new administration gets responsibility for. And clearly, the new administration was going to take over this effort. And they were both in the U.S. Department of Commerce, so they were going to coordinate, so that was a good thing. And as part of the same legislation, NBS was given a specific charge to develop a fire research center. Although at NIST we always called it the Center for Fire Research. Its funding the first year was $5 million, second year was $8 million. Again, the money's flowing, things are good. Basic and applied research into all fundamental aspects of fire. Man, that authorization wording is beautiful. It's still in the law today. If it lights on fire, we can look at it. Man, there's no boundaries there. It clearly set that the priorities that NIST would be working on would be done in consultation with the administrator, basically the U.S. Fire Administrator. During this early period, the permanent staff at NIST in research alone went from 30 to 90. So things were going pretty well. Very coordinated effort, good interactions. Now, I might point out that there was an unintended consequence. The unintended consequence was all the work that NIST was doing for the fire service before Once the U.S. Fire Administration was formed, and that was their responsibility, that group was cut from NIST and that work stopped. And the U.S. Fire Administrator's focus of what they wanted NIST to work on was not fire department related. Because at the time, they're working on the early beginnings of smoke alarms for homes. They're looking at sprinklers, trying to develop residential sprinklers and things like that. They're looking at the flammability of plastics, which are this new thing that people are having trouble dealing with, the flammability of furniture, still looking at that today. And there was a lot of work to do in fire research, but that unfortunately was the beginning of, there was no systematic program or no long-term program perhaps set up for the fire department. There were still activities going on. One of the big activities that started then was Project Fires, and it was run between USFA and NASA to look at fire environments and again extend what does your turnout gear need to do, what does your protective clothing need to do. But all this research that was being done from that point on were sort of one project at a time as opposed to a long-term program. In 1978, FEMA was established, and that's when the U.S. Fire Administration, by name as we know it today, came to be, and they were moved from the U.S. Department of Commerce into FEMA. Their funding was now sitting at about $20 million. It was fairly flat funding at around that level. The Center for Fire Research remained at NBS, or NIST, under the U.S. Department of Commerce. So now we have a little bit of disconnect. We have two different government entities that are supposed to be working together. Need I say more? Sometimes that works well, sometimes not so much. Things started happening. The bloom was off the rose, if you will. The 1980s occur, and FEMA's budget's getting cut, and of course, FEMA is starting to cut the U.S. Fire Administration's budget as well. And when that occurs, the U.S. Fire Administration, as any good manager would do, is say, well, where are we putting money? What might we trim? And one of the things that they wanted to trim was their contribution to the Center for Fire Research at NIST. Because basically they were losing about $3.2 million, and their thought was, you know what, maybe we could trim what we give to NIST, because at the time they were giving NIST $4.1 million. The folks at NIST, as you can see, were pretty panicked because that $4.1 million accounted for 72% of the appropriated funds that NIST Fire Research was getting. Appropriated funds meaning coming directly from Congress. So Congress put it back, but sort of the stage was set. And over time, those cuts occurred. NIST staffing in fire research peaked in 1980 at 123. By 1982, it was down to 97, and the curve has continued downward ever since. Today, we're sitting at around 30. So we're fast forwarding a little bit. 1991, the Center for Fire Research no longer has its sole identity. It's become small enough that NIST doesn't think it can survive on its own, and it gets merged with the Center for Building Technology, which is also a relatively small group of folks, to form a building and fire research laboratory. It's noted by its director that its funding level is quite a bit smaller than any of the other labs at NIST, and that's how it goes on. The Budget Act was not kind to USFA either, and so between 1992 and 1998, the interaction between USFA and the Fire Research Group at NIST is on the order of $100K to $250K a year. Things aren't doing so well. And at that point in time, we're doing nothing for the fire service. And I think I've mentioned in front of this group before that it was, there was a line item that was put in USFA's budget to look at a specific type of biodegradable, environmentally friendly firefighting agent. And it was a special line in. A group put it in there, said that USFA needed to do a demonstration, an examination of that, and they came to NIST and said, can you help us do this? And we certainly were glad to do that. And in one of those activities we needed to do was burn some tires. And Gaithersburg, Maryland is sort of a suburban area. When NIST initially moved out there in the 60s, it was mostly cows in the area. Now you're surrounded by highways and townhouses, and the concept of burning tires there isn't, thought of as socially acceptable. So we needed a place to burn some tires, and we went to the Maryland Fire Rescue Institute. And the main campus in College Park is also surrounded by highways and college students and apartments and whatnot, and it's not very acceptable to burn tires there either. But I met this gentleman, John Hoagland, and he loaded me in the Mifree van. He says, "Dan, I got a place for you, Cressuptown, Maryland." And off we went. And we went to one of Mifree's satellite areas, and we looked at how we were going to lay down a bed of sand and gravel and plastic so that no runoff would contaminate anything, and how we were going to be able to burn some tires in the most environmentally friendly means as possible. It was a super fun site already. It was in between two prisons, and it was thought that we could probably do it there if the wind was going in the right direction. And in that case, I guess, meaning headed toward West Virginia. The opportunity that it provided, however, was I didn't know John Hoagland before that period of time as our first meeting, and we were in the car for several hours taking this ride to Western Maryland. And John started asking me a lot of probing questions, like, why doesn't NIST help the fire service anymore? I said, "John, what are you talking about?" He says, you guys were working on the standard for helmets and the polycarbonate visors and turnout gear and ground ladders and all these things, and then you just stopped. Now, I had already been at NIST about 10 years at that point in time, and I had no idea what he was talking about. In fact, I really didn't know what went on in Emmitsburg. I'd go to Emmitsburg from time to time. We'd go to the building N in the front and meet with the people from the fire administration. I had no concept of what the fire academy was or whose budget was bigger or what was going on. There were these 12 folks that worked for the fire administration. They give us money sometimes to work on smoke alarms or sprinklers. Really didn't make the connection of what's the fire service doing here. And John helped fill in some of those pieces for me. So I came back to NIST and I looked up and saw what happened to the group that was working on the fire sprinklers, that they had no longer worked for NIST, and their employment was cut short once there was this change, once the Federal Fire Prevention and Control Act took place. So that was an unintended consequence. But what it sort of shows is that programmatic action for the fire service had kind of taken a stop. There were projects here and there that were being done, and very valuable projects and good projects, but the thought of sort of methodically going through and following a research program for the fire service had been interrupted from 1974 until the mid-1990s. 1998, there was some upheaval at the fire administration, and some of the upheaval was coming from folks at the fire administration itself saying, we need more resources to serve the fire service. And James Lee Witt, who was the head of FEMA at the time, he commissioned a blue ribbon panel. And there's some folks sitting in this room, I believe, that sat on that panel, and one of the recommendations was, you need to do research. Right? You need to be forward-looking. You need to look at the future and be ready for that next generation. You need to be ready for the next change. And as a result, they did get a boost in budget for research. Also in '98, a fairly notable thing occurred was NIOSH got funding for their firefighter fatality investigation and prevention program. Still provides fantastic information today. I just wish that they weren't so busy. So from 1999 to 2000, USFA began to fund more than $1 million worth of research per year, and some of that funding was now going for firefighting, specifically for workstation uniform, turnout gear, understanding of low-level heating and turnout gear, things like that. That was so well received by NIST that they were getting such a large chunk of money from an outside organization that we were able to fight and get, in June of 2001, get the Firefighting Technology group started. That's the group that I run today. Unfortunately, September 11th of 2001, the world changed for many, many people. And it had an impact on the small research community as well. The positive news was that in 2004, the efforts that had started early in 2001, DOC began to commit $1.8 million per year for the Firefighting Technology Group. And we still have that funding today, so that's a positive thing. The unintended consequence, the Homeland Security Act of 2002. Department of Homeland Security is started up in response to America being attacked. FEMA and USFA become part of the Department of Homeland Security in 2003. Department of Homeland Security sets up a science and technology group, and effectively, USFA is no longer a funder of research, which resulted in sharp reductions in support of fire research at NIST. So what we would hope with Department of Commerce and USFA collaborating and jointly putting money in the pot, unfortunately, we just traded it off. USFA stopped contributing, not through their own, because of the change, and now NIST, at least we had the money from the Department of Commerce, so we were able to keep moving forward, but we weren't growing as we hoped. Over the years, DHS then has put in money for research to look at things like firefighter radios, thermal imaging cameras, and other technologies that are widely used by Border Patrol and other components of Department of Homeland Security. So there has been some positive gains there. But the biggest change, the biggest benefit for the fire service really comes with the assistance to firefighter grants. Now, I know for most fire departments, they think of that as a means of getting a new fire truck or as a means of getting new SCBAs for their firefighters, all of which are very, very important. But in the context here, we're just talking about a little sliver of the money. I believe they have a 5% set aside for what they call fire prevention and safety grants. And of that 5%, they set aside a little bit more, or a little portion of that for research and development. Sometimes it's $6 million that's set aside, sometimes it's $7 million. Well, you can tell right away, right? When we're talking about a total investment between NIST and perhaps USFA in current money of, say, $2 million, $2.5 million towards research or special studies kind of projects, and now all of a sudden there's going to be $6 million or $8 million of research funded, this is a big change. How does it get managed to make sure that there's good interaction? Well, they have really positive goals. They want to reduce firefighter fatalities. They want to reduce injuries. They want to improve firefighter safety, health, and wellness. The research institutions that apply for the grant must have fire service partners. Wow. What does this mean? This means that a professor at a university can't just say, man, I need some money to fund these grad students. Here's a government grant program. Let me do a little research online and start writing a grant program. He probably has to go talk to the local fire chief. What do you need? What's the problem? I think I've got a solution. Would this help you? This is fantastic. The applied research projects, they can be clinical in nature in terms of firefighter health and wellness. They can be technology or product development, meaning you can design things, firefighter locators, better turnout gear, what have you. They could be having to do with database system development, or it could be research on how to get the information out there, how to share technology, how to share knowledge. Broad range, fantastic. Bottom line is, this isn't something that 20 years from now will help firefighter safety and health. This has to be readily applied. This has got to be stuff that's going to help sooner rather than later. So what happens? We get a whole bunch of players, some that have been involved with the fire service for many years, like the University of Illinois, the University of Maryland, and others like California Polytechnic that are new to the fire service. There are organizations created like the Center for Public Safety Excellence that were heavily involved in the staffing studies. The Fire Protection Research Foundation, a branch of NFPA, the research branch of NFPA, has heavy involvement. Many of the societies, the fire service societies and organizations, get an opportunity to join in and work together. But the key point here is the firefighters are part of the conversation. The firefighters are part of the research. People aren't doing research for the fire service anymore. Now they're doing research with the fire service. And there is such a big difference in that. And that's what's going to make the data useful, more powerful. So each one of these organizations have been working on things that either contribute to, say, firefighter knowledge or firefighting hardware. University of Illinois, for example, they develop a test standard for bailout rope. So people are testing bailout rope. A lot of people use rope, hikers, and they're using rope for USAR purposes and all that sort of thing, high-angle rescue. But the one thing about the bailout rope when you're bailing out is, why are you bailing out? Probably because the room you're in is on fire, and you need to get out of there pretty quick. Anybody test that rope against fire? So again, now they do. Right? Tracking devices. A lot of positive changes come, accountability devices. In many cases, they're still not quite there, but they're getting there. There are certainly improvements that are being made. But again, not something you want to rely on just yet. They're still making forward progress. Self-contained breathing apparatus. How can you improve it? Well, they had a couple of stabs at the flat pack and a few other things, and they didn't quite pan out at the end of the day like they thought they would. But again, people are thinking about how do we make it better for the fire service. Turnout gear. Innovative turnout gear was developed by the University of Maryland. It has back in the 70s, there was a alloy that was developed as by the Army Surface, or the Naval Surface Warfare Center. It was called nitinol. And it was a nickel titanium alloy, and was developed at the time at the Naval Ordnance Lab, and that's how it got its name, nitinol. And basically, it's a memory metal. So if you have a wire and you crumple it all up and then you heat it, it very quickly becomes a straight wire again, right? Because it remembers its original shape, and you can fix it all the time by heating it. So at one point in time, there were fantasies about, man, just think car fenders will be made out of that one day. And all you got to do is heat them up, they'll pop back and whatnot. Well, it's got titanium in it, cost prohibitive. However, with these little amounts of titanium, what they did was they put some springs in firefighter turnout gear, and when the gear would start to get hot, the springs would pop up and give you a little more airspace and try to provide some cooling. So, I mean, a lot of innovative ideas are coming out of this program. Flashover predictors, they're never going to work. But it's good to try. Don't just take Dan's word for it, try it. Why does Dan say they're never going to work? Because if we look at the NIOSH data, when we lose multiple firefighters in an incident or individual firefighters in an incident, the place that they're in just seconds before they got killed was okay. So any sensor that they would have on their body would also feed the information back to them that it's okay. And then something happened. Could be that the ceiling failed and now exposed them to the fire in the attic. It could be that there was some uncoordinated ventilation and now put them in the exhaust flow path from the fire in the room next door that they don't have time to escape from, or they fell through the floor into a burning fire. Nothing's going to predict that, right? There are too many parameters, too many things involved. Compressed air foam. So a lot of things looking at here in terms of firefighting hardware and capabilities. The biggest increases, I think, have been in knowledge, understanding the modern fire environment. Dr. O'Neill alluded to it earlier, how synthetic materials in our homes have 2 to 3 times the stored energy per pound that cotton and cellulosic materials had. The interesting thing is the sofas today are also lighter. Well, the fire service knows quite well that surface to mass ratio plays great importance in how fire is going to spread and how fast fire is going to grow. So if we have a less dense piece of foam that has a higher potential heat release rate compared to a 4-pound cotton cushion with springs, we have a 1-pound foam cushion on that sofa. Not only does it have more potential energy, but it's also going to burn faster. The fire is going to spread through it faster. So we're going to get a higher peak sooner. Structural collapse hazard. Again, Dr. O'Neill pointed out an example there. You know, the fire service is not going to stop that. Economics, the way we want to live, people want to have big open spaces. They don't want to have little closed down spaces. Those are all everyday quality of life kind of things. A lot of these materials serve incredibly great functions for, let's say, polyurethane foam. It doesn't mildew like the old cotton cushions could, right? This is a big advantage. People that have allergies, lack of spread of disease, all sorts of things. It holds its shape better than the old cotton cushions. That's why it doesn't need the springs in it, right? It's good, serviceable materials, fantastic products, modern miracles of chemistry and all that sort of thing, right? However, there's that unintended consequence that if it gets ignited, it's going to go. It's going to burn and burn very quickly. Same thing with the Building and construction. What's driving building construction besides costs? Energy efficiency. Houses are literally, every house built today is wrapped in plastic, literally wrapped in plastic. Insulated very heavily. Why do they do that? They don't want water to get in or get out. They don't want air to get in or get out. So if you're going in there to fight a fire, any of the smoke and toxic gas that's being produced by that fire is going to stay where? Early on, it's going to stay in that box. So it's to your best advantage to understand that, number one, and number two, work to manage that. So that's where fire dynamics comes in. If you understand how a fuel-rich environment is going to react to ventilation, you can make some better choices. If you don't understand the fire dynamics in that box, how can you do a risk assessment? How can you say we're going to risk a lot to save a lot? You can't. You're just guessing. But if you understand fire dynamics, you do a thorough size up, now you've got a leg up on the process. Ventilation. Sometimes it's good to ventilate quickly, other times not so much. Other times you may not want to ventilate at all until you have water on that fire, because ventilation will just make the fire bigger. Wind-driven fires. Simplest things is keeping the wind at your back, keeping you upwind, because high pressure always goes to low pressure. You don't want to be on the low pressure side. Hazards on the fire ground in terms of smoke and particulate and things like that. And again, building systems. Modern systems like solar panels on the roof. How does that affect potential for ventilation? How does that affect your ability to de-energize the structure? I'll give you one example of interaction. This is just one of the projects in my group, Firefighting Tactics Project. So our objective, again, is to improve the safety and effectiveness of firefighters through measurement science, the buzzword at NIST, to advance suppression tactics and examine non-traditional means of fire suppression, and then most importantly, get the results out to the fire service. And we've got some milestones here, and the idea really isn't to read all this stuff, but to look at the highlights. You know, we're doing it with FDNY and UL. We're working with UL. We're working with the Spartanburg Fire Department. We're working with the International Society of Fire Service Instructors. We're doing it again. We're working with Prince George's County, Chicago, San Francisco. We're working with IFSTA. We're working with NFPA. All because they were able to get grants that brought them to the party to work with us. Right? This is this big leveraging. This is this big resource multiplier that the Assistance to Firefighter Grants has brought to town. How do we transfer the technology? Well, I do a lot of presentations like this, 36 to 40 a year, and we reach some number of firefighters. The big deal is electronic delivery, right, if we can get it. So fire engineering, we did FDIC, Science in the Big Room. They have 2,000 folks there in person. Then they put it on as a webinar. Then they're making part of it into a DVD, so they'll continue to sell that, have that out there. International Association of Fire Chiefs got some prevention money, so they can also do a webinar and develop a portal called FSTAR, Firefighter Safety Through Advanced Research. Again, for fire chiefs trying to condense this plethora or this flood of data that's coming out of all these universities and whatnot, and condense it down to information that a chief can look at and use. International Association of Firefighters. They've got, through grants, have developed several videos. And one of them we put online, Fire Behavior and Tactical Considerations. We got more than 25,000 views in 10 months. Right? So we're making impact. We're getting information out there. International Society of Fire Service Instructors have some online courses, and because they're developed, all this is developed through the grant money, it's available to firefighters around the world for free, right? 24/7. Click on. You got to register a little bit because the government wants to count. They have to show, hey, look, 10,000 people viewed this course. And then, of course, the UL Firefighter Safety Research Institute, they have about 6 courses online. The most recent one is the online course, basically, that documents all the Governor's Island work that was done with FDNY and other fire departments consulting, and we have the webpage there. That was released in April of 2014. So NIST has a web page. We try to provide links to all these things from the NIST web page to sort of give you one place to go. IFSTA has their web page that you can go to with online training programs, and I'll give these slides to Bob so that you don't have to worry about copying the addresses down, and they're also on the NIST web page. ulfirefightersafety.com, cfitrainer.net has a program on fire dynamics and some firefighter line of duty death incidents that were analyzed by NIST. IFF, again, has their YouTube channel, IFF TV, where, again, you can get some nice training drill material coming off of there. NYU Poly has a program that's called Alive. They refer to it as recursive learning, where basically a firefighter can go through it and they'll be getting some information, then they're asked questions every so many slides, and if they get it wrong, they get routed back into the system and the data is presented again in a slightly different manner. The neat thing is they've made their platforms that are available on iPhone, iPad, and Android, and it's not surprising nowadays to have young firefighters in the truck bay actually looking at their phone, looking at some of this information. LA County, with no federal funding, decided we're changing the way we train firefighters. We're doing it online. If LA County has to reach their 3,300 firefighters that are located in 170 stations across a very broad geographic area, it's going to take them a year to a year and a half to get one training evolution in with each one of their firefighters. So instead, what they do is every month they push out a short video. They're near Hollywood, so it's very high quality. They push out a training drill that the company officer has to put his engine company or truck company through that goes along with that video. So they're getting some hands-on work, and they have a learning management system where everybody has to check in with it. And it works out pretty well. The training director now can see out of his 170 stations in the 3 shifts who's taken the training and who hasn't. And if they haven't, he can check in with them pretty quick. What happened? Did you forget this month? What's going on? Oh, we were busy, Chief. And they can look up their run records to see if they were that busy. See if he needs to go visit them. Right? So they're really training their people in a very, very different manner, cost-effective manner, and using the technology to do it, and they've gotten very positive response. You can see the positive response in the run records where they said, Chief, on this fire we sized up, we used door control, we limited the growth of the fire, got the line ready, went in, hit the fire, we were done in 2 minutes. Right? Nobody injured, nobody hurt, limited the damage to the occupant structure. That kind of very positive feedback is what they're getting. Again, the FSTARs we mentioned through iChiefs and modernfirebehavior.com is where the Governor's Island piece lives. What are we really trying to change? Well, in the 1980s, there was a big switch, and through the fire library here in Stillwater, well, we're not in Stillwater, but you know, in Oklahoma, OSU, it just feels like we're there. I was able to go back through a lot of the training documents from the 30s to present. And the big change occurred between 1977 and 1985. And that change, whether or not it was intentional, was a reliance on turnout gear, a reliance on technology. They started to trade off knowledge of fire behavior and tactics based on the fire behavior for, we need to make sure that you put your SCBA on and your turnout gear on. And at that point in time, these new tactics evolved. Whenever possible, attack from the unburned side to the burned side. Ventilation was only spoken about in a very positive manner, and so it kind of got interpreted, you vent to cool. It became determined that the most effective and efficient fire attack in your turnout gear and your SCBA would be from the interior. The plan was to attack basement fires from the interior, from the top down. And there was a stipulation, never said why exactly. It typically just said, don't flow water from the outside. Well, I can tell you that we can go sit down and go through NIOSH report after NIOSH report where firefighters did exactly these things, and they ended up dead. So why is this fire research important to the firefighters? Well, we've been burning buildings now for about 10 years between UL and NIST. A lot of acquired structures. We've moved the research out of the lab, or we're complementing the lab research with structures, whether it's a school gymnasium that we're flashing over, a high-rise in Chicago, or a high-rise in New York City, or townhouses in Chicago, or single-family homes just in the Chicago suburbs. Looking at the gear, understanding the capabilities, and perhaps more importantly, what are the limitations of your gear thermally? Interestingly enough, that's not always taken into consideration in the design of the gear, right? They want the radio to work. Well, under what conditions does the radio need to work? That's another question for another day, right? The gear is so good today that your skin is the weakest link, right? Your skin's going to go away at around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The gear is going to slow down the movement of that 160 degrees to you. But if your gear can take 600 to 800 degrees without showing any damage or being any worse for wear, you know, it's a fine line. And we have situations where then fire chiefs have firefighters that are dead in gear that looks brand new. So it's important to understand the heat transfer and understand how the gear works and pass that along to firefighters. Our ability to model fire behavior using computational fluid dynamics models such as the fire dynamics simulator developed at NIST, so we can understand the firefighter line of duty deaths, such as the wind-driven fire in Houston where the wind came in these windows. The firefighters were here, at least that's where we found the nozzle and the burnt remnants of their hose. Their bodies were found here and here with their face pieces melted out. You know, they were in the flow path. They were in the exhaust. Or this case in New York City where a firefighter had to bail out this window and he was burned pretty badly. The fire originated back here until tactical ventilation occurred and they opened up some vents. Fresh air came in the front door. These folks, these firefighters in this room got hot. What was their instinct? Break the windows. When they broke the windows, they pulled the fire right to them. Prince George's County, they were taught. They were on the downwind side. There was a fire in the basement. They opened the front door. They went in the house. The wind blew the door closed behind them, and they were caught in the heat and burned. A very tragic one. This is a report that will be coming out soon. Captain Herbie Johnson, Chicago Fire Department. His officer is seen in a security video coming out of the structure in his shirt sleeves. They did a size up. They saw they had flame coming out of the attic, front and back. Looked like they were getting involvement in the porch. There were occupants in this room in the kitchen just moments before. They didn't even know their house was on fire. A neighbor down at the gas station saw flames and smoke coming from the home, ran a few doors down, knocked on their door, told them to get out of there. They left. The officer goes in, sees that there's a glow around this door. Goes out, tells his officer to take the hose line up to the second floor, hit the fire. Before they can get the line in operation, the captain and the firefighters located back here. The captain, we believe, is located in this area. The upper portion of this door fails. High pressure goes to low pressure. He's overcome by the heat coming out of the enclosed porch. He drops. His firefighter drags him into the kitchen. The rescue company comes, takes him out of the kitchen. They get him to the ambulance. They get him on oxygen. He seems to be getting better. He's talking. Because he's talking, they don't intubate him. He gets to the hospital, his trachea swells shut, and he dies. Leaves behind a family. I'm in this kitchen the next day. The salsa that the family was working on, the salsa bowl's still sitting on the counter. The only thing damaged in this room here, which is just a few feet down the hall from where the fire was, there's some plastic bowls sitting on top of a refrigerator that have one side of them is melted and distorted just a little bit. Doesn't take a lot. The human body's a pretty frail thing. Fire has a tremendous amount of energy. It can overcome your protective clothing. So we need to do something to try to control this energy early on before you have that, what if I get exposed to, what if that door fails? What if that window breaks? Try to take some of those what if consequences out. The big story of all this research, of course, is that the fire service has always been taught this. The fire is going to start, it's going to grow, it's going to become fully developed, and it's going to decay. That is a fuel-controlled fire model. It means the fire has all the oxygen it wants, and it's going to decay when the fuel's depleted. In the environment that firefighters work today, if the occupants don't leave the door open, you've got this house that is basically a well-insulated cooler with fire inside of it. It's going to chew up the oxygen inside. It's not going to achieve flashover. It's probably not going to generate enough energy to break the double thermal pane windows. And then it's going to go into the early decay or smoldering mode, which means that it's got fuel-rich gases. Right? We know that liquids don't burn. We know that solids don't burn. Only gases can burn, right? Because it's got to mix with the gaseous oxygen in order to have that chemical reaction of a fire. So we've pyrolyzed the solids. They're sitting as combustible gases. They're hot to some degree, and the only thing they're missing is oxygen. If the fire auto vents, you might have fire showing when you arrive. Otherwise, you might not have anything showing. If your reflex time is slow enough, the fire might be out by the time you get there. If you're a little bit faster, you might just catch it right when it's coming down. You pop open the door to take a look. You don't have a line ready yet. You leave the door open. You go back, tell your firefighters what to do. Next thing you know, it's flashed over. Or worse yet, you have high staffing, and you only see smoke, and you send firefighters in there ahead of the line to do a search. And what happens? This kind of thing happens. So we're here on the curve. We have ignition. We've got a fire started on the sofa. That we're looking at the front of the townhouse there. The fire grows a little bit. We have flames hitting the ceiling. We have smoke spreading across the lower level, and we also have smoke spreading into the upstairs bedrooms if the door is open. This is going on in less than 2 minutes. Then we get our first fire peak. Again, this is happening at about 3 minutes in time. Notice that we have a heavy push out that upstairs window that was left open. We have a heavy push of smoke around the cracks of the door because we have a high pressure gas event going on inside the structure. High pressure goes to low pressure. Outside it's lower pressure, so any kind of vent that it can find, it's going to push out of. But then because it's consumed the oxygen that's available in that structure for combustion, the temperatures drop. The flames go away. The gas temperatures in that living room drop by more than 1,000 degrees in less than a minute, from 1,400 degrees the ceiling to 400. What's showing outside when the firefighters arrive? Nothing. As soon as you open the door, you can see that we have a bidirectional vent at the door. Hot gas is coming out top, fresh air being sucked in low, and because this vent is above the neutral plane of the fire, where that exchange of fresh air and hot gas is going on, this is a unidirectional vent, high pressure gas coming out. It's an exhaust vent. And now the fire is starting to pick up. You can see the glow. Within 80 seconds of that front door being open, the living room is post-flashover. Lethal conditions are throughout the structure, even for a firefighter. So if you had firefighters that you sent in ahead of the line, unless they were extremely fast, they're either bailing out a window right now or trying to come down, fight their way down through the fire to get out of that house. These tests were done last May. It makes a difference what kind of water, what kind of tools you choose for fighting the fire. These are down in Spartanburg. I've got 2 rooms with similar furnishings in them, and they're connected by this hallway. So there's a door on the rear of the structure that we're looking into, looking up the stairs in between, that's located right here is where we're looking in between these 2 rooms. This is a video view, thermal imaging view. This room is going to get attacked with a 150 gallon a minute straight stream, bouncing it off the ceiling, leaving the low pressure vent open. And we're looking for bad things to happen here. So far, it doesn't look too bad. Cools the gases off in this room. Doesn't have any negative effect in the hallway. Now we're going to take a fog flowing 150 gallons a minute, but most of the fog is just capping the window, creating a high pressure. That's not good. Once you cover that window with high pressure, where are the fire gases going to go? To a low pressure. Right? And so you saw that very dramatically there. Once we actually start to get some water in the window, we're going to darken down the fire a little bit. They're going to shut that down, and then we're going to hit it with a straight stream. So it's not the water droplets pushing it, it's the fact that putting a fog line in front of a window like that and capping it creates a high pressure. It's the equivalent of putting a fan in front of the window. And that's why you displace the burning gases to where there's fresh oxygen. and they knocked the fire down. Last year, when I gave the presentation on fire dynamics, we talked about leadership, how the leadership of FDNY was so adamant to keep their members safe and to improve how they can protect the public, that within 18 months of conducting experiments with folks that they didn't know 2 years earlier, they were changing the way they did business on wind-driven fires. And not only that, they went back to the federal government. They went back to FEMA, to the AFG grant system, to say, you know what? That research that you provided tells us that what we're doing is not the best we can be doing. We need to change how we do it, and we need a grant so we can train, so we can buy equipment, so we can implement this strategy. The folks at the AFG office were so happy that somebody was utilizing their research results. You know, they made sure that that grant got funded. So they bought fan units, they bought wind control devices, high-rise nozzles. Firefighter training and education went into play. They start rewriting the SOPs. They got 11,000 firefighters trained in a very short period of time. They did it with classrooms and DVDs and evolutions at their training facility. Installation of computer kiosks to keep that training going in each firehouse. So each firehouse had a computer where they could access information. The use of that Alive program we talked about, developed in partnership with NYU Poly. All this stuff was implemented within 18 months after the experiments were done. They've continued. September 2012, they finished their SOP on the wind-impacted fires. 2013, ventilation, brownstone, row home fires, and private dwellings. Because they're leading, these changes are not limited to FDNY. Chicago, Illinois, and surrounding departments, LA County, Houston, Columbus, Ohio, Montgomery County, just for a few to list. I'm going to let the summary sort of speak for itself.
Fires are popping up everywhere because of our dry weather situation. When a structure is involved, there is always the fear of someone being trapped inside. The man from this fire near Southwest 59th and Douglas is recovering after being rescued from his burning home. Oklahoma City fire crews have been working around the clock lately, but what you probably don't know is they are fighting structure fires in a new way. A change put in place because fires have changed over the years. 15 to 20 years ago, firefighters say the materials in homes were different.
A fire where most everything is wood or cotton or wool. Today everything is made out of plastics and things like that, so it spreads much quicker and it gets much hotter.
Now they're using a tactic that is on the cutting edge of firefighting. It's called resetting the fire, much different from before.
Used to, what we would do, we would arrive on the scene, we would crawl into the house and not squirt water until we got to the seat of the fire and knock it down.
Now they use thermal cameras to measure the internal ceiling temperature of the burning house and first douse the home with hoses to cool it down before going in.
We're knocking the fire down, we're putting water on the fire, knocking it down, and as soon as we get it knocked down, we go inside the house with other hose lines trying to completely extinguish the fire. Research that's been done has proven that lowers the temperature and it gives the occupants a greater chance of surviving.
OKC firefighters say this is a safety win-win for them and those they help.
It's a positive change.
Now they started using this in September. It is now standard procedure for the new year.
I never went to Oklahoma City to give a talk. Steve Kerber never went to Oklahoma City to give a talk. Lori Moore found that clip online, sent it to me. I did have a chance to talk to their deputy chief. It's part of their protocol. Basically, they said they were stalking us online, looking at every YouTube video and going to conferences and whatnot, getting the information, they put it in action. And just in closing, last week, it seems like last year already, last week and this week are really quite, I think, historic, because there were actually 2 individual full-scale research projects going on for the fire service, one led by UL with an AFG grant in Milwaukee, where they're looking at attic fires and knee wall fires, and one where we're looking at walkout basement fires in Pennsylvania that NIST was doing, and they were going on concurrently. So I mean, the fact that there's so much effort going on for the fire service, I hope they embrace it and use it to their best advantage. Thank you very much.